And so to our feature interview with a man tasked with figuring out how bad this could get and what the social and economic impact will be. He is Carlos Lopes, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, who joined us here in Doha for an exclusive interview.
Well, I've been there twice, and I think in the region. I think, of course, it's dramatic. You have about 13,000 cases of people infected. You have about close to 5,000 people that have already died. And obviously, the numbers are quite dramatic. But if you compare them with other diseases of the same type, epidemiological diseases, like for instance, right now we don't talk anymore about SARS, we don't talk about HN1, we don't talk about tuberculosis, we don't talk about many other diseases that kill much more people and are much more infectious. So that is the medical part.
Okay.
On the economic side, it's also quite dramatic because these three countries were doing rather well. In fact, they were in the top tier in terms of performance, and all of a sudden, it's a very difficult situation because of all the consequences coming from Ebola. And I think, you have different predictions. The predictions from the countries themselves, none go close to zero growth. They still have a little growth.
Yeah.
But if we were to actually look into a zero growth scenario for both 2014 and 2015, we'll be talking about something in the range of 0.05% of Africa's combined GDP being affected, which is almost nothing. It's a thin air in terms of economic impact for the region.
For West Africa?
For the region, all of Africa. If it is, if we are talking about West Africa, it's slightly higher, but we are talking about 1.9% impact.
Okay, so you're saying that the economic impact isn't as dramatic, and yet, I mean, other organisations, the World Bank has been talking about a lot, sort of, I'm not going to say doomsday scenario, but a lot worse than that. Well, where's the discrepancy there?
Well, what the World Bank is doing is basically looking into three scenarios. And of course, if you look into the worst case scenario, they are saying it can have an effect of about 32 billion. But they are not saying it's about the impact of these three countries in the economy of the continent, but rather the perception impact. You know, the panic, hysteria, stigma can provoke incredible damage. They have done that so many times in the past. And, you create this situation where it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if you say it's so bad, it's going to happen.
Yeah, but it's also prudent to go to that worst-case scenario because we are dealing with an open-ended crisis here. There is no end in sight. There's no end date on it. We haven't realised this could get a lot worse yet. So maybe it's prudent to be thinking along those lines as well.
You see, when you have a situation of emergency, think about the tsunami. You always have this contradiction or paradox. On one hand, of course, you want to mobilize international response. You want people to give more money. You want resource mobilization drive to be the catalyst for so many transformations for the long run. On the other hand, you may incur into exaggeration. And the exaggeration in itself provokes a lot of problems. You see, in Africa right now, we are dealing with the stigma that is growing by the day. And this is going to affect economies that have nothing, absolutely nothing to do with Ebola. So the 32 billion scenario, just for the people to realize, is almost 4 times the size of the economy of these three countries. So even if these countries just disappeared, hypothetically or theoretically, it would not have been as bad. And yet, we are talking about these numbers because of the stigma and the consequences of perception.
You mentioned international reaction, mobilizing international funds. How strong has it been? Because what we always get in these situations is lots of promises, but not necessarily fulfilled.
Well, if we look into the pledges that have been announced by the key players in this game, we are talking about $3.2 billion already announced.
Pledged.
But then when you look into the ground, and we have been talking to the leaders of these three countries, you don't see even close to that. I think we are right now at about 15 to 20% of actually disbursements taking place on the ground. It's obvious that part of this money that has been pledged is actually to support the interventions themselves of the countries. So they are not going to give this money to the affected countries, but rather send medical units. And like, for instance, the UN has done about 500 flights.
Right, so it takes on different forms. It's not just, here, take the money.
Still, 15% is quite low.
So what to do about that? Do you just pressure countries to come good on what they've promised?
Absolutely, and not only pressure in terms of making sure that the pledges are transformed into real disbursements, but also to make sure that the countries have some role to play on this. Because you see, if we have all these very strong, well orchestrated interventions that are going to last only for a few months, and then everybody basically goes home the moment the numbers start to drop, you are not going to really deal with the issue, because in every single country you had an outbreak, and we are dealing with outbreak number 14. So this is not new. Every single country that had an outbreak, it comes back. And obviously it's not creating any panic or damage in Congo or in Uganda, because there is capacity to deal with it. So you always have very small numbers that have nothing to do with the kind of challenges that we have with other diseases. But what is it going to happen in Guinea, Sierra Leone and Liberia if we actually don't leave behind the capacity to deal with future outbreaks?
Overseas countries, the other thing they might do is want to spend money on beefing up their own defences. Now, you've made the point that, you know, Ebola is here and it's not through the rest of Africa, and there have been limited cases elsewhere. But again, does that fear factor prompt people to, or countries to put their money into their own resources and make sure that their defences are up? I mean, because look, it is a disease which can travel.
Well, let's be clear. It's a biosafety hazard. Ebola is one of the most deadly diseases. Not as much as people are actually thinking, but it is pretty bad. So therefore, you know, in every single army that really carries the name with pride, there is capability to deal with biohazards of this kind. This can be transformed into biological warfare. It can really go out of control. So you have to have the capacity and you have to have the response. So it is not a surprise that the type of interventions that are being offered to these countries have some military component, because that's where the research is and that's where the capabilities are. But let's be also frank, this response that is being tested in these three countries is also a way of, you know, testing the capabilities in case there is a bigger problem in the countries concerned. So I absolutely understand the need for a better coordinated response capacity being almost like the objective number one right now. And I think that is actually not only to the benefit of the three affected countries, but to the world.
Are there other parts of society in these countries which are breaking down as a result of Ebola? I mean, we've talked about healthcare issues. What about infrastructure? What about education? These sorts of things being affected by either the crisis or the stigma of the crisis?
Well, schools are closed. No kids in these three countries are going to school. You have a situation where manufacturing is very much affected by the lack of shipping lines wanting to service these countries. Agriculture, of course, is quite disrupted because the epicenter of the pandemic in the three countries is basically in the rural areas. You have a situation where the fiscal deficit is growing because obviously the countries are not collecting taxes. This is not the kind of preoccupation you have in a situation of this type. So you have really a situation where the capability of countries, fiscally speaking, is diminishing by the day. And the only way you can deal with it is by a stimulus. You need a financial package that will allow the economy basically to keep afloat.
Okay, so this makes me want to double back to what we said originally, because your original comments in this interview were about how the economic impact has been overstated and it's perhaps not as big, and yet everything you've just described is so fundamental. Agriculture, education, trade, these things are, you've just said, are being badly hit, but yet you still think the situation's been overstated?
No, I don't think it is overstated in terms of a problem. It's overstated in terms of the figures being mentioned. Because let's take the case of Liberia. Liberia is a country where 1/3 of its revenue comes from remittances. Are the remittances going to be affected? No, because, you know, the diaspora is actually sending more money.
More money as a result,
because of the result of the pandemic. Then you have the mining. Mining accounts for another 1/3. Mining, yes, it has diminished quite significantly, but it has not stopped. In fact, some of the mines are actually keeping their targets on track. What they are saying is that we are not going to invest new money until this thing is over. So you already have two elements that are contributing for most of the economy. So one thing is the economy, another thing is the social impact. The social impact is huge because people used to live with subsistence type of activities in agriculture and so on that are now heavily disrupted. So they are really in need for help. Some even in need for food aid because they just don't have the rice, stocks in Liberia, for instance, are depleted. And now it's 1 month instead of the 6 months they normally have. So yes, one thing is the economy, another thing is the social side. But what I think is frankly very exaggerated is not the situation of the three, but the situation in relation to the rest of Africa.
Sure. Dr. Lopes, it's been fascinating talking to you. Very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.